Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Business of Property. I am your host, Cheryl Leong from Property Development Australia. At the Business of Property, we interview superstar guests in the property development space that share their expertise, deals, and stories to help empower, build, and grow our community of property developers and investors. So hello to Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube land, whoever's live here with us today. Drop us a hello in the comments wherever it is on your screen. All right, did I say screen? Oh, screen. I meant screen. Our guest tonight is Craig Hopfe, who is the Subdivision and Principal Certifier at Landcert. So during his 10 plus years in local government, he was responsible for managing multi-disciplinary teams with engineers, town planners, and construction and subdivision officers that oversaw a lot of subdivision DAs within one of the fastest growing councils in New South Wales, which was along the northwest. So this has given Craig a very unique level of experience and understanding of the legislative controls, planning framework, and engineering required to apply to subdivisions specifically, which is what we're talking about today to demystify subdivision certification. So Craig's here to make certification, oh my goodness, clear and simple. So without further ado, may I please invite Craig down to the Business of Property dance floor. Hello.
Hi, Cheryl. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Craig. Goodness, certification is a big mouthful. I'll say it once and not say it again today, but that's what we're talking about.
Can be a complicated topic, yes.
Craig, tell us about what is it that you do, because we hear certifiers in development all the time, like subdivision certification, building certification. Demystify that for us, please.
So we're essentially council. They've allowed for the privatization of certain certification processes within development and allow registered certifiers who have got enough experience. So we have to go through and put a pretty in-depth report through to fair trading, get registered and make sure we have the experience and the qualifications to do so. And then they allow us to do the certification essentially on behalf of council. So we are a public authority. So even though we're private, we do represent the government in a way. So yes, we're essentially council, but just we don't, I suppose, have to handle the same amount of external inquiry. So we can really focus on the core business of what we do, which is subdivision certification. Obviously in council, you have sorry?
No, I say so we're specifically talking about subdivisions, like blocks of land that you're splitting into one or into many.
Yeah.
And
so
it's just the land only.
We also include that for like your unit complexes, industrial complexes where you're doing strata certification. So not actually, so if it's a residential flat building, you're not subdividing the land itself, you're subdividing the building into different units. So you can come through a subdivision certifier to get that work done.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited to be learning a lot today. I personally love subdivisions, but, I think it's really important for our community to go, what does subdivision certification mean and what's the whole process around it? So this is going to be a bit of an education piece. Anyone that's watching, if you have any questions, pop it in the comment section below as well, and we'll shoot them out to Craig. So let's start off with the basics. What's subdivision certification?
So a subdivision certification is you've had your old process, which is you went to council, you got your DA, you got your construction certificate, and then you got your subdivision certificate to create the lots. Subdivision certification is exactly that process. You just don't have to come to council for different aspects of it. We are council.
And is that all sizes of subdivisions or just the basic ones?
It can be any size. So it can be a corner lot subdivision where you've got an empty lot, you're putting a line on a piece of paper to create 2 lots, or it can be all the way up to approving construction or subdivision work certificates for DAs that approve thousands of lots and create regional infrastructure with roads, on-site detention basins, big regional basins like soccer fields that are kind of sunk into the ground to hold water in rain, have periods of heavy rain. It can be the whole kit and caboodle.
Okay, so and how different is it to a building certifier?
in concept, it's very similar. We still issue a building certifier will issue a construction certificate. We just issue a subdivision works certificate. So the process is the same. It's just what we're actually approving, which is different. So what I might do is, can I share it? If I can share it.
Yeah, that would be great. It's show and tell. I love a bit of show and tell.
Makes it a bit easier. So I'll just quickly share a screen. All right. Now, so essentially, most people are familiar with when you go to council, you get your development application approval. So we'll just talk on a small scale at this point, 1 into 2 subdivision. You go to council, you get a corner lot with a building. So a house, 2 houses attached, and you want to subdivide the lot, build the 2 homes, and then sell them off separately. So the process for that would be you still have to go to council to get a DA for building and the Torrens title subdivision. From there, you can then go to a building certifier. The building certifier will approve the actual house. The subdivision certifier will approve the subdivision work. So whether that be drainage lines or any other works that are associated with the subdivision, this is where it gets a bit more complicated. If it's a DA approved by council and a Torrens title subdivision, council in New South Wales, council has to be the principal certifying authority or the principal certifier, which means council still has to issue the subdivision certificate. So a subdivision certifier in this instance, so if it's a DA for building with Torrens title subdivision, we can only issue the subdivision works in this instance, the subdivision works certificate, which is generally drainage, or it could be if you're doing something a bit larger. So if you're doing a bigger development, creating 15, 20 lots, but you're also doing the houses. So some of the project home builders will quite often put a DA into council to create 20, 30, 40, 50 lots and build the homes on there. So both approvals are done in the one DA. The subdivision certifier will issue the roads and drainage approval, on-site detention. But the developer still has to go back to council to appoint council to do the inspections. And appoint council. Exactly. Council still has to sign off on the subdivision certificate. So in that component, the subdivision certifier can only issue the subdivision works certificate. So legislation doesn't allow us to do anything more in that instance. With this information, I am basing off of, let's say, an 80-20 rule, where this applies 80% of the time. Depending on the scale of development, there may be situations where a private certifier can act as a PCA, but that's for much larger developments. So you're talking more than 5% of DAs across the state each year that the principal certifier can act as the PCA. The subdivision certifier can act as the PCA.
And you'd sort of think that there's a bit of irony there in a sense, because you're like, why larger, and maybe I'm misunderstanding it, why would larger sites be okay for PCA to sign off, whereas smaller site? So have I misunderstood that?
No, you haven't misunderstood anything, Cheryl. You've pretty much hit the nail on the head very, very early on in our discussion. You're right. And as an industry, subdivision certifiers, we're always advocating for the ability to increase legislatively what we can do and what we can help the industry with. As I said before at the start, to become a subdivision certifier, it's quite a long process. It's essentially a 10-year process. So you have to, almost all subdivision certifiers are engineers. So that's a 4 to 5 year civil degree. And then you have to have 5 years experience. More often than not, that's within council doing DAs, CCs, and assessing subdivision certificates. So it takes about 10 years to get to the point of which you can actually become a registered certifier and put your own name on a piece of paper to sign off on it. So considering they will allow us to do things which are called state significant developments, where we're talking thousands of lots, big infrastructure, and we can act as a principal certifier and sign off on that. But at this stage, from a legislation perspective, we are unable to do that when it's a smaller 5 or 10 lot subdivision. Is something that we as an industry are obviously pushing for, because we obviously want to be able to help the industry in whichever way we can.
Which you'd think anyhow, sort of the small, medium-sized developments are the ones that you've got a whole lot of volume. It's 80% of the stuff that you deal with. And, you don't want to, it takes long enough in council to begin with. You want to free up that capacity, right?
Yeah. And look,
so that's really interesting.
Oh, look, and I'm an advocate for council. As I said, I've spent 10 years working in council, and there's lots of good engineers, town planners, and just generally good people inside a council with lots of experience. But council obviously has a very wide-ranging responsibility within their local area. So as an assessment officer, you spend a lot of time not necessarily doing the nuts and bolts assessment of a development application because you've got so many other conflicting priorities.
Yeah.
And so you can't really focus down where, as I said before, as subdivision certifiers, we don't have the same responsibilities as council does from that all that extracurricular stuff, essentially. Probably not the right term, but it means we can just focus solely on our core business as a business and get through the applications. Now, the industry's actually, and legislation is getting there. If we can, what I might do is I'll flick through to the bottom. We're jumping ahead a bit on the ways here. But in, I think, 2018, they introduced something called the Low-Rise Housing Diversity Code, where historically, if you wanted to do a 1 into 2 subdivision, this was your process. You'd go through, you get your DA for your dual lock, which would include subdivision. You'd then get a construction certificate. Potentially, we could do that small subdivision work certificate, but then you have to go back to council. Council issues a subdivision certificate. The Low-Rise Housing Diversity Code introduced a mechanism which allowed that whole process to happen without council. So just to explain what's happening on the sheet, I'm happy to make this available to anyone who's watching or anyone who wants it later.
This is really helpful, Craig, so thank you.
That's right. The blue stands for what a building certifier can help you with. The black stands for what a subdivision certifier can help you with. Both of us are private entities. And then the orange is what you have to go back to council for. So when we're looking at historically, the process for development applications, there's obviously a lot of orange in there. And as you said, councils have a lot of workload, so it can take them a while to get through assessment applications. The low-rise code provided an opportunity to do that style of development without the need of going to council at all. Well, for the major applications, you still have to go to council to get some of the smaller applications, like a driveway application, because you're in a driveway within the council road reserve, so you have to get their approval for that. But to get the actual building approval and the subdivision approval, you could do it all privately. So it made that process a lot faster. So I know generally councils can take a couple of months to get to a DA, and then you're assessing it. You start the back and forth. If there's a variation to the DCP, they send comments back. You then have to get your town planner to respond. Town planner responds to council. It sits down. It waits again for a bit. As a certifier, and I've partnered up with a building certifier as well, you're generally looking at a 5-day turnaround for your building CDC, and you're generally, for a subdivision CDC, you're looking at a couple of days max. You can go from not having an application to be able to give something to your builder to start working and building the property within a very, very short period of time, like 15, 20 days, to go from nothing to go ahead, start work.
And noting this is for New South Wales specifically as well, I'm aware that in other states, the subdivision certificate doesn't necessarily need to be done before the actual start of build. Is that the same situation in New South Wales, that there's a level of time? Have I triggered something?
No, that's a very good question. So when you're doing a DA through council has the ability to determine when you get your subdivision certificate. So as you said earlier, I started off as an engineering council, just looking at DAs from an engineering perspective, roads, drainage, very technical stuff. Engineering either works or it doesn't. The water either flows downhill or it doesn't. I then took over a team of town planners. Town planning is a very different beast to engineering. Town planning generally is far more subjective. So your development control plan has the objectives within the DCP, and so you can seek variations to that. So they may say, yes, you can have your subdivision certificate, so create the lots before you build the house, depending on the type of property you're actually developing. Under the low-rise code, the legislation is very clear in regards to the timing. So it says that to do a subdivision of a dual occupancy, for example, under the low-rise code, you've got to get your building CDC first. So as an applicant, you'd make an application. I recommend for both at the same time. You make an application for both your building and your subdivision CDC, but your building CDC has to be issued first. So your building certifier will look at the product and say, yes, that complies with the controls for a dual occupancy. It's then the subdivision certifier, like myself, can issue the subdivision certificate. You then go through, build the development. You then have to get your building OC first. So I actually can't sign off on your subdivision certificate until you've got your occupation certificate. So as part of the legislation, it says that you need your OC before I can sign off your subdivision certificate. And once I've signed that subdivision certificate, generally your surveyor will take that to New South Wales Land and Registry Services to create the lots. And it's the creation of the lots that allows you to actually sell them separately. So me signing the subdivision certificate doesn't formally create those lots from a legal perspective. You take that signature that I put on a piece of paper, send it to LRS, and they create the lot. Then you sell it.
Does the builder OC need the final OC, or can it be an interim OC?
It's generally final OC.
Okay. Yeah. So you've got to get all any sort of landscaping and everything done and all of that to get final, and then you can do your subdivision.
Yeah. And there's different controls in legislation for different types of development. So it's interesting you say landscaping. From a subdivision perspective, a dual occupancy, there's not a lot of requirements for us to check for landscaping as part of the testing legislation. However, for a multi-dwelling terraces, the legislation is quite clear on the need for us to check the landscaping requirement as part of our subdivision certificate assessment process. So it is important that the different types of development, so using this low-rise code, there's 3 main types of development you can do. You can do the dual lock, you can do a multi-dwelling housing terraces, so your old school terraces, or you can do a manor home, which is essentially just a really big 2-story house, which is broken up into 4 separate units. The manor homes can't be Torrens title subdivided. So your dual locks and your terraces, you can do a Torrens title application, and they can create them as completely separate lots. Your manor homes have to be done as a strata title.
Yep.
So,
got that. We've got a question here. Can a subdivision title be obtained prior to starting the build?
No. So the subdivision CDC can be, and I highly recommend you do, get the subdivision CDC before you start building. But to get your subdivision certificate, you need to have your OC. So you can't actually create the lots. And that's where, I suppose that's a difference between from a DA perspective and a CDC perspective, because DAs are done under the council's local environmental planning policy or local environmental plan and their DCP. So they can have a look under the DCP and say, is there a pathway for approval where you can get the SC before the OC? Going back to what I was saying before with if you have a project home builder where they put a DA into council to create 10 new lots, and on each lot, they're putting a freestanding house. So that house isn't attached to the house next door, they're freestanding. Councils will quite often allow you to get an early release of your SC to create the lots and just get you to put a restriction on the title to say that, yes, we've created those 5 lots, but on those 5 lots, only the homes that were approved under that DA can be built. So that way, council has certainty over what the product that's been built on that lot. The homeowners have certainty. They can still vary that if they want. They just have to put an application into council to do so. Under the low-rise code, it doesn't give us that ability. Under the low-rise code, the OC must be issued before the SC.
If anyone's been confused by OC, SC, PC, CDC, and DA,
what I can do is...
We have a terminology sheet somewhere.
The development industry loves acronyms. It's how we operate. So a DA is a development application. That's what goes through council. A compliant development certificate is a CDC. A compliant development certificate can be done outside of council. That's what a registered certifier can do. PC is your principal certifier. That's the person who signs off on the final certificate. So principal certifier from a building perspective would be your building certifier, and the final certificate they're signing off on is the OC. From a subdivision perspective, the PC is the person who signs off on the subdivision certificate. Now, the PC, when you have a development application, so I'll try to remove the acronyms. When you have a development application, the principal certifier must be council. So when it's a Torrens title subdivision approved via a DA, your principal certifier is council. If it's strata, you can go through a private certifier to get your strata certificate. That would be this process here. So if you have a DA for a building with a strata subdivision included, so let's say a residential flat building or like a unit complex,
Yep.
you've got the DA, the DAC. Sorry?
Yeah, that can go straight to the strata certification without having to go back to council if it's a strata.
So, you get the DA, it says, I'm creating 101 lots and strata subdivision of the building. You can go to a private certifier to get the building CC and the OC, and you can go straight to a registered certifier to get the strata certificate. There is a time frame requirement on that. If you have a building, I'll see if I've got an example here. Here we go. If you have a building that was a DA just for the building, and it's not a dual lock or a secondary dwelling, so let's talk the unit complex, to get a CDC for strata subdivision, it needs to be within 5 years of the DA being approved. So if you've got a residential flat building and it was approved 5 years and 1 month ago, a subdivision certifier like myself, we couldn't issue a CDC for the strata subdivision. You have to go back to council to get a specific DA for the strata subdivision.
Oh, okay. So is that right? That's a time limit, and if it lapses, is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So we've got to go back to council.
Yeah, obviously like DAs, they lapse after 5 years. The ability to issue a CDC lapses once the DA is more than 5 years old. So if you haven't, that's why I suppose my biggest, and I'd like to leave a couple of points, useful tips for people. It's just, if you do have to get certificates, it's always best to get them as early as you can. Yeah. Because once you've got the certificate, it obviously locks it in. So for example, under the low-rise code, this one here, if you don't get your certificate, let's say you get your CDC for your dual lock, you've got it, you start building, happy days, but the legislation changes for whatever reason. If that legislation changes in a way that it prohibits the subdivision of that dual occupancy, you're stuck, which means you can't subdivide. But if you got the CDC for both at the same time, which is this process here, the one I think is the best, like a best practice perspective. Yeah. Once you've got that CDC, even if that legislation changes, that approval stays valid. So you still have the ability to subdivide it. So the biggest takeaway point would be, if you know your end goal, it's always a better idea to get those approvals in place as soon as you can. Because
risk minimization there.
Exactly. And there's a whole bunch of other things that get a lot easier once you have those subdivision CDCs in for that low-rise code, utility approvals. It's just from a best practice perspective, always the suggested option.
Yeah, cool. Craig, we've got a few questions here. How can I find out subdivision costs and council contribution costs for townhouses? So subdivision costs, I'm assuming, there's costs through council or the certifier, and then there's the actual physical, civils costs as well.
There's lots of different costs associated with doing a subdivision. I'm going to speak broadly across this topic because the costs vary depending on where you're doing the work. So, and it depends on, I suppose, when they say the subdivision cost, what are they talking? So, for example, you got a cost associated with a DA, and that will be based on, it's a factor of how many properties you're developing. So, for example, different councils within their fees and charges will say a DA for X amount of lots is this much money. That price is set in legislation. So it could be $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, or $10,000, $15,000, depending on how many lots or townhouses or dwellings you're creating. That's just for the DA. I'm not going to talk about consultants' costs because that's a whole nother ball game. But you'd have all your consultant costs. You'll have your town planners' costs. You'll have your engineers' costs. If you have to get reporting done, so environmental reporting, tree reports, arborist reports, heritage reports. So that's all associated with the DA. The council contribution cost, you have to contact council to get that. So depending on where you're developing, there's two different plans that you use. You can it's called the 712 or 711. So the section 712 plans are the contributions when they're not in a release area, essentially. I know I'm oversimplifying that, but it's kind of how it works. And that's normally done as a factor of the cost of your development. So I'll say, There's no fees associated with less than $100,000 worth of cost. But then above that, it's a percentage of this. That's set by the council. With the Section 711s, that's in your release areas, the Schofields, the Northwest Growth Centres, the Southwest Growth Centres. They will normally have a contribution cost based off the amount of lots you're creating. And that could be $50,000. That could be $70,000. That could be $30,000. It really depends on the actual area you're developing. Historically, it was capped at $30,000, but over the past, I think, 7 years, they've been increasing that to the point where it's uncapped. So the overall answer, sorry, that's a really long answer to the question. The overall answer is if you contact council, they'll actually give you an estimated cost because their 712 will set the fees, but that's set at a certain point in time. So let's say that was done 3 years ago. They index that every 6 months or every 12 months. So if you want a specific cost for the contributions for your development, contact council and just ask. They'll send it through. They'll send an estimated contribution cost.
Am I correct to say you should be able to find this in your DCP as well under a section that says contributions, and it will say if you're developing above a certain TDC, whichever, build cost, it will be the 1%, 2%, 3% of total costs as well.
Yep. So you'll find it in. So if you look in each council's either Section 712 plan or Section 711 plan, that'll have the fees, and then you just have to index accordingly. So have a look at when it was done and do a CPI increase. So that would give you a ballpark figure. Easiest way, if you are seriously considering it, just send council an email. They'll send it back saying this is what you'd be looking at.
Yeah, like for your rough feasibility sort of for calculations. And then sort of the new release areas, you've got the council contributions, but you also have to consider like your special infrastructure levies.
The SIC levy.
As well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's
what are those?
The special infrastructure contribution, that's got to do with more regional infrastructure. And you're stretching my memory here in regards to the exact fees for that one. That is, I would recommend that's only applicable to certain developments. So in that instance, I'd definitely recommend that at that point in time, you just contact council to get that. When you're talking special infrastructure contribution, you're looking developments greater than 1 into 2. That's when you're looking at creating roads within a regional infrastructure, within a growth centre area. So, and it would be very much dependent on the scale of work. So for that, I'd definitely recommend just contact council. They'll be able to give you a rough ballpark depending on where you're developing and what you're developing.
Yeah. And if you need to, obviously speak to a few people who are, in that development management space that are putting feasibilities of these together as well, which might be able to guide you.
So when you're getting into development of that scope, in my experience, each area kind of has consultants that operate predominantly within that area. So people who are then looking at doing 5-lot subdivisions, 10-lot subdivisions, 30, 100, 300, 400, 1,000-lot subdivisions. That's not an application they're putting together by themselves. That's not an application you can. That's an application where you're going to have a statement of environmental effects generally done by a town planner. You're going to have your engineering consultant doing your engineering work. If you're doing a subdivision of that nature, you're probably going to have your arborist report. You're going to have your heritage report. You may have a bushfire assessment that needs to be done. Each individual council do have, and I'm not going to say this, they operate, different consultants are solely operating in different councils, but in my experience, you do have consultants who have a strong representation within that area, have many DAs within that area. They're the people that you can speak to because they would have got DAs out for similar types of development that you'd be looking at. And they can say, perfect, I did a DA for a similar amount of lots 6 months ago, and within the DA conditions, this was the contributions. This was the So they can give you a rough estimate of what it would be.
And here's a tip as well, I guess, if you're developing in a particular area, a particular suburb and a council, the best place to go is to go to a council's website and have a look at DEAs that have been approved. And if they've got the documents there, you're able to see, the DA that's been approved, any conditions there, and usually they set out the contributions as well.
Now, I've been outside of council. I don't have to worry about this, and I have no affiliation with this website. There's a website called planningalerts.com.au, I think it's called.
Yes, used to be free. I'm not sure if it still is.
I think it still is.
Okay.
And you can put in your address, you could put in a radius, and that'll give you the approvals that have happened within a radius or within a time frame of that address. So that's a nice, easy way to find. And then quite often you can then take that information, go across to council's DA tracker, put in the DA number, and then you can quite often also pull out the plans, potentially pull out the development consent as well. So that way, if you were looking to do that real early, high level due diligence, that's a very good suggestion, Cheryl. That would be a easy way to do it.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Let's move on. More questions coming up, left, right, and center. When you refer to the low-rise code, housing code, do you mean class 1 as defined in the NCC?
Yes. So it doesn't necessarily have to be class 1. A manor house isn't a class 1 building. A manor house is generally a class 2. Now, I also have to, early on, you said, what's the difference between a building certifier and a subdivision certifier? This question's the difference. As a subdivision certifier, we don't get involved in the BCA or NCC. That's fully contained within the building certifier's purview. They're the ones who do that approval. But the low-rise code doesn't necessarily mean a class 1, because your dual locks are class 1, I believe, 1 and 10, 1. Your multi-dwelling terraces are class 1. Your manor homes, because they generally have an underground basement, I think it's also a fire perspective, they become a class 2 building. And just talking from my experience alone, from a low-rise perspective, there hasn't been the uptake in the class 2 space. I believe class 2s are a bit more of a lot of people are cautious about class 2s because there was a whole Building Practitioners Act that's in now. So anyone who's involved in the design of a class has to be registered, has to provide certification. I believe that they have to get, for the OC to be issued, it has to be signed off by the what's his name?
The building commissioner.
Yes, I believe he has to sign off on the OC. So class 1, dual locks, terraces, huge uptake, which is essentially where Landcerts come from. The class 2 space, yes, it could be done under low rise. Commercially, I haven't seen as many of them come through. I hope that answers the question.
They're a pain in the bum. Well, because you can have a fairly simple development, but the fact that it has a basement and it comes under class 2, then you've got a whole lot of things with, like I said, fire ratings, facade requirements that typically you might not have. So it is, I think, even with building certifiers, not a lot of them have really taken that up, because also there's a whole restriction with the insurance that they've got to acquire to be able to certify for even with class 1 and even more with class 2.
Yeah, and I think it essentially just comes down to economies of scale. All that extra work from a certification perspective, and look, I think it's a good thing for the industry. The industry as a whole, obviously, from a responsibility and a liability perspective, I think it's good to make sure everyone knows what they're doing. Everyone's registered, everyone's experienced in regards to what they're designing. That's not a bad thing at all. But it's also economies of scale. If you have all this extra certification, all this extra registration, all this extra insurance, there's costs that are associated with that. You can wear that cost over the much larger residential flat buildings, which are creating 100, 150, 200 units. It's a lot harder to wear that when you're only creating 4 strata title units on a corner lot in the middle of suburbia.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, if there's anyone that's a class 2 certified here and would like to have a bit of a chat, that would be amazing, because I said we're not seeing a lot of these. They are having to come through, but we've experienced, and we've also heard a lot of people have a lot of challenges with getting it over the line as well. So
from what I understand, it's a whole different ball game.
Yeah. All right, subdivision certification. This is what we're here for. Are there any pretty pictures here? Because I think the fact that you've been able to simplify it, it's incredibly helpful, because particularly because you're saying that these different routes to take. Again, if anyone wants a copy of this, please pop your comments in wherever the comments section is there. So the in summary is that it's not only with CDC that you get involved. There is a DA component there, but you get involved in the depending on the steps that need to be taken.
Yeah, it's essentially, I don't want to say horses for courses, probably a bad analogy. It really depends on what the development is and the approval pathway you have to follow. Going back to that really early topic, we as subdivision certifiers at industry would love to be able to take on a much larger role for DA Torrance subdivision. So for example, the one in the middle here, where if you're creating some roads, some drainage, some new lots, we're more than experienced enough to do that. It's what we did at council. Currently, obviously, we can't legislatively, so we are, as an industry, advocating for that. Because at the moment, yes, that we would like to be able to free up council's time and assist councils on that to be able to do that work. But yeah, so that's why here, just kind of a lot of the time, a lot of questions, a lot of phone calls I get are people who don't understand, because it's quite hard to get a handle on it because there are different applications and approvals pathways. It's kind of to show, cool, this is what you're doing. This is who can do it for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
You go back to council to get those final certificates.
So we've got a few people who are keen to get a hand on a copy of this, Craig, if you wouldn't mind flicking them through after the session. So is there anything else within sort of subdivision and the certification process that we should be aware of that maybe we haven't really discussed or thought about? Because it looks like it's like, do we just tick boxes? Are there any other things in terms of like conditions and things like that we need to consider?
Oh, look, and I have made this as simple and high level as to really give a good understanding of who can approve what. Those boxes are actually quite complex. So if we're looking at this box here, I know I made it seem very small. It's a little green box. Just go through, build your dual lock. It's fine. No worries. That's actually quite complex. And so the information I would say is, if it's not something you've done before, ask the question, speak to people who have, because subdivision certifiers, building certifiers, we see it day in, day out. So we see developments which, for example, under the low-rise code, you have to, in Sydney, under Sydney Water, you have to get 2 Section 73 certificates. So it's a compliance certificate to say that your dual lock has both sewer and water supply. Now, I've had developers, owners, mums, dads, who don't realize they need 2 of those certificates. You need one for the dual occupancy and you need one for the subdivision. They have built the dual lock and they've come to me for their subdivision CDC at the end of the process. House is built. I go to the subdivision CDC. It then takes Sydney Water a bit of time, a couple of weeks, to then get the 73 for the subdivision, which means you can't get your subdivision certificate until you have that Section 73 certificate. So that then delays the creation of what, and you're now got the construction costs. You're all built, so all those, and you're sitting on that for a couple of weeks while you're waiting for that certificate. If you'd got that subdivision CDC when you got the building CDC, you could have got those 2 Section 73s essentially at the same time.
Yeah.
So when you get to that endpoint, you get your OC, you can then go through and create the lot. So even though it's a small green box on the plan, there's lots of details around what approvals you need, when you need them, and how long they take. And that's where having a good builder, having a good certifier, essentially having a good team put together for your development, getting the right people on your team, the difference between a development that flows nice and easy. And obviously we try to make it as simple as possible, and do that is through having this knowledge, seeing all these things that have happened. That's the difference between a subdivision that just slides through, a dual lock that gets built, subdivision gets registered, you move on to the next one, versus one where there's delays at different points. Infrastructure wasn't put in correctly. So for example, you haven't put it in for a Torrance title. So you get approval, but it doesn't work when you try to subdivide. So then you have to go through and redo some of that infrastructure, some of those gas connections, electric connections. They're the delays that can cost money. So it's just getting the right team together to get that green box as simple as possible.
And can you, say if you hadn't done it before you start construction, is there an issue if you're doing it midway through construction?
Nah, absolutely not. It's more just, and that's what I mean. You can do that process in the middle. You can get the subdivision. I have plenty of jobs where they get the subdivision CDC halfway through construction. I would always say that the best process would be get it at the same time, because I know get a bit technical here with development applications. When you lodge a development application with council, that essentially locks in the legislation that you're being assessed against. So, for example, if multi-dwelling housing is permissible within R2, your normal residential area, when you submit that DA to council, if that's permissible in R2 at that point, even if that LEP changes the following day, your DA can still be approved against the LEP that was in force when you submitted your DA. A CDC is different. A CDC, it's the legislation that is in place when I approve that CDC. So if you get your building CDC approved, you don't do your subdivision CDC, and suddenly legislation changes, you're out in the cold. You won't be able to subdivide it, or you have to go back to council and start that whole process through council to try to get the subdivision approved that way. And if it doesn't comply with their requirements, you may end up with a dual occupancy, which is 2 dwellings on one lot that can't be subdivided. And so you can't do it off separately. So from a risk management perspective, yes, you can do it at different stages. It always makes sense to get it done straight up.
Do it all together. We've got a question here from Craig, have you done any manor house strata subdivision CDC? Were there any challenges that you've come across?
No.
Wow, there's a whole lot of stuff happening there.
No, we haven't approved any manor homes. As I said, there hasn't been the uptake from an industry perspective in regards to the manor homes. As if I had to put something down, I have to say just be economies of scale, given the Class 2 nature of the building, given it has to be done in R3 zoning. I haven't seen the uptake of that.
Yep. I haven't seen too many.
To answer that, are there any challenges you come across? I think it's more of a market-based challenge in regards to it mustn't be. From a certifier's perspective, it is something we can approve, but obviously the market has to put it forward for us to approve, and just hasn't.
Okay. So you would strata subdivision. Okay.
Yeah. So for a manor, you can't Torrens title a manor. It's got to be strata. The other two, dual locks and multi-dwelling housing terraces, you can do Torrens and strata, depending on the style of development and the land area of the property.
Thank you for clarifying that, Craig. Well, I think it's been incredibly educational, so I really appreciate that and the effort putting this together. If you can respond to anyone that wants a copy of it, I don't know if you've got a landing page or a link. We can also share with our listeners your email so they can reach out to you as well if they want to talk about either any of their projects that they're working on, noting that Craig works across sort of the New South Wales. Would it be across all the different councils? Yeah,
so we can do certification across under the state environmental, so that covers the whole state, but we can also do DAs for each individual. So essentially across the state we can service the developments.
Fantastic. So info@landcert.com.au. Thank you very, very much, Craig. It's been fantastic. I've learnt a lot. And for anyone that is keen to, again, have to chat about your subdivision, Craig's the person to talk to as well. So it's been great. Thank you. For those of you that have joined us today, I hope you enjoyed that and you got a lot of value. Make sure you visit and subscribe to the YouTube channel, The Business of Property, with more of these sorts of fantastic interviews that we have, and hit the like button to get notified when a new episode goes up. So until next time, keep well. We'll see you again. Ciao, ciao. Bye.